Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. They don't know what they don't know. Your frontline managers need process management skills, brought to you by the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development. CPED offers online and in-person programs and certificates that will give you the modern, relevant skills needed to advance your career. All of our programs offer interactive live learning sessions facilitated by instructors with practical business experience. CPED also partners with organizations to provide customized professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information on the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please visit our website at uwcped.org. And now I'd like to introduce you to today's facilitator, Steve King. Steve is an instructor here at the Center for Professional and Executive Development and has been for over a decade. He served as the center's executive director from 2012 to 2017, and prior to that, Steve served in various HR leadership roles, including executive vice president of HR for Hewitt and Associates and vice president of global talent management for Baxter Healthcare. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you so much. And I think we're off and running. So hi, everybody. Steve King here. And the topic of the day is process management skills for frontline managers. And this sort of other additional title is what they don't know, they don't know. And so this is actually material from my newest book, Prevention and Contingencies. Let me explain why we have that particular title. What we know, what they don't know, they don't know. And this is actually an origin story. So I actually have to take you back quite a few years, actually about 30, in order to begin this story. So I once worked for BMO Harris, what was then just simply called Harris Bank in Chicago. And I was given the task to do a needs assessment for management development. And basically what I did is I went around and talked to 100 different managers at different levels of the Harris Bank organization, asking them, what do you think you need in terms of development and growth to become a better manager? And they gave me typically what you would expect you to hear. In order to become a good people manager, you need the following kinds of things. You need to know how to do a performance review very well. You need to be able to hire the right people. You need to become kind of like a career coach. You need to be able to help people figure out how to develop themselves and grow. You need to give people feedback. So I would describe them as the things that you would expect to hear when asked the questions, what do you need to be and do as a manager? But I noticed that in this conversation with the managers, this 100, there were a handful of them, maybe 4 or 5 or 6. They tended to be more the seasoned managers. They actually talked about something else. They talked about what they called process management skills. And when I probed around for what they meant by that, they said, well, you know, I inherit these processes. I'm supposed to run these processes, manage these processes, but no one's ever told me how to do that. And so this really caught my attention, that it was a small group, 4 or 5 out of 100, but it was tended to be a more seasoned kind of managers. So I went back and I basically debriefed all of my interviews with my bosses and so on and said, here's my observations about what people need. And by and large, they ask and need for people management skills. And then I talked about the little subset of process management skill need. So we had limited resources, and given the fact that all 100 of them talked about people management skills, we agreed that's where we'll focus our attention. So this whole idea of process management skills just sort of went to the back burner and really didn't give much thought to it. In fact, at that time, you know, in U.S. history, U.S. industries, business history, the whole idea of continuous improvement, Six Sigma, Lean, we're talking about Dynamic, Kaizen, it was all kind of coming to fruition anyway. So I kind of figured at the time, well, you know what? A lot of what managers are talking about are probably covered off by those kinds of things. So maybe even though we don't have to pay attention to it, it would just sort of seep into basic management activities and skills, and so it would go. So I sort of set this all in the back of my mind, figuring it will sort itself out. We'll focus on people management skills. And away we went, had successful people management skills program, and so on. Things were going really well. Now, as my career progressed at Harris Bank and then moved on to Hewitt Associates and eventually to Baxter Healthcare, I actually started teaching less and less and less. And so I was not in the classroom with frontline managers on a regular basis. And then about 10 years ago, I found the opportunity to come back into the classroom. And one of the groups I've always loved spending time with were frontline managers, people that are sort of new to management. And so I specifically requested I be able to teach at least some of the classes I was focused on for frontline managers. Great. So I'm in this class, back in the classroom now, and talking to various people and some in the class. And at some point early on in one of the classes, here's what I asked. I asked the question, I asked it very sort of naively with no particular intention. I asked the question, so how many processes do each of you in the class own? And I got this sort of blank stare from everybody. And I said, well, how many do you think you own? And here was the answer by more than 50% of the people in the room. I don't know. And I was stunned by that notion, because if a manager's responsibility, primary responsibility, might be to manage the productivity of a team, how do you manage the productivity of a team if you don't know which processes you own? Because isn't productivity really a function of the people, work, tools you have, and process them, and a few other things as well? But processes are clearly an important part of how you can effectively build productivity. And I was a little stunned, my aha moment, they didn't know. And so I kind of probed around. I was like, well, what do you do if something goes wrong with a process? And their answer was, well, I just fix it. And what that told me was that they were reacting, not proactively, but reacting to any process issue that they were faced with. This classroom moment was an aha moment for me. And what it did is it pulled back to me something from 20 years before that these seasoned managers had said, which is someone needs to teach me about process management. Clearly, these people in front of me in this class had not had that happen. So the next time I was in a classroom, I simply asked the question again, well, how many of you, what kind of processes do you own? How many do you own? And got the same thing. 50, 60% of them said, I don't know what processes I own. And then I've asked that question continually whenever I was with managers. By the way, not just frontline managers, but often more senior managers as well. And I continue to get that answer. In fact, those of you listening to this webinar right now might ask yourself the question, how many processes do you own? And I would guess, based on my experience, about half of you know. And the other half, well, think you know, I guess. And so, and the second question, so what happens when you what's wrong? It's either, well, I just fix it, or I call someone in to fix it. Now, when I ask them who they call to fix it, they usually say somebody with a belt. And what they mean by that is a yellow belt, a green belt, or a black belt, which I'll talk about in a second. So given that this is the case, that managers know they need to manage productivity, but they don't seem to know much about their own processes, we started beginning and thinking, well, maybe we need to focus our attention on helping managers manage processes well. And so let me explain what I mean by process management as it relates to maybe process improvement. So I'm making a distinction here that's more probably relevant to a manager than it is to a black belt, who probably would quibble with some of the distinction. But basically what I suggest is process management is about enhancing the status quo, whereas process improvement is about changing the status quo. And the metaphor that we use for this would sound something like this. Process management is about the maintenance and repairing of a car, and process improvement is about the redesign of the car. Most managers, most of the time, are not going to take the time to redesign processes, particularly while they're busy using those processes. And as a result, really, they would need what they want to know is, how do I maintain and repair the process I have in front of me? We'll call that process management. So there is a relationship between these two. A lot of the same tools you would think of for doing good process management are very similar tools that you would use for process improvement. So for example, the ability to do root cause analysis is important for both of these. It's just an extent issue, or how big a difference there is. And so in this case, we're talking about the smaller one, which I believe probably is more of the 80% one. Most managers, most of the time, are just trying to maintain and repair the process that they're working with at any given point in time. So the question is, so what exactly does it take to do good process management? So we began doing some analysis on this, and basically we had a hypothesis, and it sounded something like this: that the root of good process management, it's all about prevention and contingency, or preventative measures and contingent measures in a process. Meaning, when I have a process in front of me, can I have built into it the right preventative and contingent measures so the process goes well? And the research we did is we actually ended up going out and having conversations with really best practice managers, best cost managers, and talk to them about, so how do you manage your processes and how does that work? And in fact, they basically confirmed what the hypothesis was. They said, well, what we really do is we kind of project out what could go wrong with our process and then build in sort of maintenance issues, preventative and contingent measures to make certain the process continues on. So once we kind of confirmed what the hypothesis looked like, we began actually teaching the idea of process management. I'll show you in a moment the specific example of process management, but we began teaching it. And then in follow-up programs, or the follow-up to the programs, we were basically asking people, when you applied some of the techniques we gave you, did you improve the quality of your process management? We heard universally the answer was yes. So I want to actually distinguish between preventative and contingent measures. I'm going to continue with my metaphor here. So unless you own an electric car, the metaphor probably works. So a preventative measure is really an activity you do to prevent things from going wrong. So if we go back to our car metaphor, that would be like changing your oil. What you're really doing is changing your oil every 3,000 miles maybe, because that helps prevent the car from overheating and damaging the engine and so on. A contingency measure in the car is like a spare tire. And that is, you've got it sitting there just in case something goes wrong with a tire. So that's your contingent measure. And this simple metaphor is what we mean by the difference between a contingent measure and a preventative measure. So not surprisingly, we determined there was basically a process for process management. And so like all processes, there are certain steps in the process here. And basically, there's kind of 7 of them. Here they are. Number 1, in order to manage your process well, you need to understand and know your process. Now, that may require you to do some process mapping and diagramming. For some people, the process is so simple you don't need to do that. You kind of know what it is and you kind of explain it. But basically, you need to know the steps in the process. Number 2, you need to be able to label steps in the process with standards so that you know that when that step is completed, it's met a certain standard. And of course, the process as a whole has a standard that has to be met as well. Third, you need to know what the acceptable variances from standards are. So sometimes the standard is 10, whatever that number is, and it has to be 10. But sometimes it's anywhere between 7 and 11, and that's an acceptable variance. You need to be smart enough to figure out what the acceptable variance is. And you can see already, 1, 2, 3, there's a lot of overlap between process improvement and process management. They are very similar. Number 4 is have a reporting mechanism so that you can judge the variances. In other words, you need to have a way to know if you're off schedule, off standard. And so there needs to be some kind of reporting mechanism back on a regular basis so that you can judge that. And then here's the 5th one, here's the key one. Based on what you've seen, you need to install preventative and contingent measures where there are key trouble spots in your process. So let's say you have a process that has 10 steps, and you notice that step number 4 is where things tend to get bottled up. That's your trouble spot. Well, that becomes a great candidate for a preventative or a contingent measure. Preventative being stop it from bottlenecking. A contingent measure, you pull the plug and you pull the trigger when that something bad goes wrong at that point in time. Now, the 6th step is to analyze the performance data regularly using your reporting mechanisms. And the 7th one is to execute the contingency plan if necessary. So basically, you now have the process for process management. And what we did is we began teaching managers how to do this, how to actually go through these 7 steps. And as we did this, what we really realized we were doing is the following. We were actually creating a kind of scenario planning. And so what we really were doing is saying to managers, once you know what your process looks like, know the process, and the standards and acceptable variances, steps 2 and 3, you basically are kind of running in your head a movie that's basically saying, I imagine the process in motion. Where do I imagine the process will break down? So if it breaks down in step number 4, you're really doing scenario planning going, I project that's going to be the problem, and this is where I'm going to put one of my contingent or preventative measures. So really, the process of process management is really a kind of scenario planning where you're imagining moving forward what the process looks like and imagining where the problem it will exist, and then building your maintenance systems into those particular spaces. So we began to actually talk about this in terms of, it's like scenario planning at a very micro level, just like senior leadership scenario planning when they think about strategic planning for the whole organization. What we also found is that there were certain, I'll call it companion or associated competencies and perspectives that needed to be played out when you did process management. And here's 4 of them. Number 1, team situation analysis, problem solving, decision making. Process management is a team sport. Let's say you have a process that involves 3 or 4 members of your team. Well, knowing the process should be understood by the whole team. Setting standards should be a team activity. We should be talking about a reporting mechanism the team all understands. And the notion of building contingency and preventative measures should be a team activity. And so I always make certain that people understand that process management, while it may be led by the manager, is really a team activity and should be thinking about it in that light. Secondly, how do you pick out the trouble spots in a process? And what we learned is a few things. For some processes, you have such rich data that the data points you to the certain spots in a process, saying that's a problem space, that's a problem step, it deserves a preventative measure or a contingent measure. In other cases, it's simply the experiences of people using the process. You know, if you've run a process or managed it for 20 years, my guess is you know pretty much where it's likely to bog down or have a problem. And so experience should be taken into account as well. Now, when there's not a lot of data and when there's not a lot of experience, then sometimes you just have to build an assumption in and test it. So you look at a process and say, I haven't used this process very much, but I have a strong assumption or belief that that step right there could be problematic. And maybe in the absence of data and experience, you have to rely on some assumptions and then watch the process unfold and change your assumptions if you need to over time. Also, what we found is that people have to have a sense of certainty and risk associated with the process. So processes in something like a nuclear power plant have such a high risk if they fail that there you probably employ quite a few preventative and contingent measures. You want to do that. Same with like flying on a plane. So something like risk assessment is going to be an important role in determining just how much process management is going to be necessary. Certainty, by that I simply mean how clear are you, how certain will you have to be that the process has to unfold exactly a certain way. So similar to risk. Third item, decision rights and process management. What we learned, and when we talk about process management, is that managers have to be very clear about the decision rights in a process itself. So if I have a process of 20 steps, the first 5 are Bill's, the next 5 are Tad's, the next 5 are Judy's, and the last 5 are Michelle's. Naming clearly who's got the decision right helps manage and move the process along in an effective way. When decision rights are unclear in a process, there's often confusion that leads to a process bogging down. So kind of essentially decision rights are kind of standard and we kind of roll them in. And then finally, the last point, connecting process management to people management. So I want to make a specific comment about this, which will be our last slide here. There is a relationship between people management and process management. So that story I told you a little while ago about, well, by the Harris Bank people, a few of them talked about in some way process management. The rest of them did not. That's a shame that everybody didn't see them together, because in fact, what happens here is that the clearer your processes are and the better your processes are managed, the easier it's going to be for you to do people management. So let me make that distinction for you. When you have good processes, that means you have clear understanding of standards. When you are doing somebody's performance plan and saying, this year I want you to meet these goals, often those goals are tied to the very same process standards in the process itself. So if I'm saying you need to make this many widgets per hour, well, that's tied to the process. Or if you make this many sales per month, well, that's tied to a process. And so what we really learned is that great people management, things like performance planning and performance assessment and giving feedback, are actually tied to having good processes so that you can leverage them in some way. So there's actually a link between the two. And so now I think back to those days at Harris Bank, and I realized that those more seasoned managers, those 4 or 5, were actually saying to me without saying it, I can manage people better if I understand my processes better, and vice versa. And so I always encourage managers to think in those terms. If I happen to be talking to sponsors of frontline management development, senior people who are kind of creating the development for their managers, what I always do is say, of course you want to have some kind of course or program or training in performance planning and giving feedback and doing a performance review and doing interviews. Of course you want to have all that. But you also need to have some kind of learning experiences about how to manage a process. In fact, whenever I see any organization, they show me their management development program, I just take my finger and scan down the list to see, are they doing anything around process management? If they aren't, then I will often point to that and say, I think you're missing something, because they don't know what they don't know. So this last slide, you'll see there's a picture there of a guy named Elliot Carlisle. He was a professor at Amherst. He actually died recently, but he wrote this great book, which, by the way, for some reason it got inverted on the slide. So it's not jam, it's actually the reverse, it's Mac. That's what it's actually supposed to say. And basically what he wrote is this little book, which is a series of parables about management. And it's one of the few books I've ever read where it actually does link together process management and people management. And it's a shame that he was not more well known as an author or as an academic, because I think that he was on to something, which is this link between the two. In the absence of that, one of the reasons I wrote my book, Prevention and Contingencies, was to fill that gap so that managers have something they can lean into on the process management side to go along with the people management side of the equation. And so, folks, managers don't know what they don't know. They're not quite sure what process they even own. But if they did, and they were just given little guidance on how to manage them, we have found their productivity improves substantially when linked with great people management skills. So that's the story. And I thought I'd just take a moment now and see if there's any questions coming from those of you today listening in on the webinar.
I've got a few here to get us started, Steve.
Okay.
I love your question about asking managers about how many processes they own. So if managers aren't certain about how many they own or which processes they own, how do you help them understand and find out what is under their ownership?
Well, there's a couple ways. The most obvious way is to simply go ask your manager, so what are you holding me accountable for in terms of process management? And ask them that question. Now, some might not be able to answer you, but often they can, and they're giving you a real clue about what it is. But I think there's a more profound way to do it, which is you got to think about who your customers are. Some of you have internal customers, some of you have external customers. And then you ask yourself the question, what am I delivering to those customers? And once you have the answer to that, the next question is, what process am I using to deliver that to that customer? And if that customer expects the delivery of the product or service, you probably own that process, or at least you co-own it. And that's probably a clue. So I think you got to think, who's your customer? What processes I do to deliver the services or products to the customer? And I think that's how you kind of figure it out.
Thank you. Another question here is, how does something like automation impact process management?
Well, I think the answer is profoundly. And so what I mean by that is, the more automated a process is, the more automated you can make both preventative and contingent measures. So let me use an example to illustrate the point. So let's say you had a recruiting process, and you're trying to automate parts of that recruiting process. And one of the things you're automating is the job requisition process, or that part of the process. So if your process says, you cannot move forward with hiring a new person until you enter a rec, put in all the information about the new job, and get approval from your boss about the hiring. Well, in the past, you have to kind of walk all that around, but if you automate that, it would sound something like this, or something like this. You cannot get the rec done until you have properly, that's the key, properly fill out all the form. And that's a preventative measure to make certain that you don't screw up the job requisition step. Or maybe you can't move forward in the process until you get sign off from a manager, another preventative step. Perhaps in the past, people were moving forward without permission, and that was a problem for the process. So I think automation actually profoundly affects process management, because you can build directly into the automation a lot of preventative measures and even some contingent measures as well.
Thank you. Another question here is, how much of each process should managers know about the necessary tasks and skills required to execute the process? Should they be able to do the process, or should they just know what needs to be done and who should do it?
I think more the latter than the former. Is it useful if the manager to do the process? Of course it is. But I think we live in a world where that's not always the case. And so what we know is that someone's hired to be a manager, and there's maybe 2 or 3 of 10 processes they own that they've actually never managed before. So they're going to have to rely on the people that work for them to actually help them understand what the process is. That's why it's a team sport, right? And what you're trying to do is map out what that picture looks like so that you as the manager understand it. You might not be doing all those steps yourself. Maybe you never have. Maybe you never will. But the fact that your team and the members of the team that will execute the process do, you can manage to that. So ideally, sure, but I just don't know if that's realistic nowadays. There are going to be some processes managers have never actually executed themselves.
One more question here for you. This sounds very much like doing an FEMA. Would that be a good approach to accomplish this?
I'm sorry, I don't know what that is. What is that?
Well,
Oh, well, maybe the person
Jason,
can.
if you want to go ahead and put that in there, we'll have Steve answer that. Let's try one more in the meantime, and we'll see if we can get Jason to give us a little more information.
Okay.
How often should managers redesign processes?
Okay, as opposed to maintain the process. I think that whenever you know that the process is no longer meeting customer needs, or you believe it's beginning to no longer meet customer needs, it probably deserves a reconsideration of design as opposed to maintenance. So if I can repair it and maintain it and still deliver customer expectations effectively, then I'm probably in process management mode. But if I'm beginning to have a lower quality product, or customer expectations have gone up, and so my process is no longer meeting those higher expectations, I think you got a candidate for more like process improvement, process redesign. And so that's the headline. I think that's the trigger, I think, for me.
Okay, we've heard back from Jason.
All right, thank you.
And he said it is a failure mode effects analysis.
So I'm
that
guessing.
Is often,
go ahead.
That is often used in quality programs to assess and prevent failures.
Yeah. So all right. Thank you for the definition. So the answer is the same principles are being applied here, right? You are projecting into the system and saying, where do I believe the failure is likely to happen? And where you have convinced yourself that there's failure likely to happen at some percentage, let's say 10% or 100% or whatever it's going to be, that's where you plug in the preventative and contingent measures. So like I said earlier, the tools of process management and the tools of process improvement are probably on the same workbench. You're just probably using them a little differently. Again, the metaphor is simple for me, and it is for most managers too. You're trying to maintain and prepare the existing one versus redesigning the new one. I will add one more thing. A lot of managers I talk to have real mixed feelings. I call it a love-hate relationship with black belts. And what I mean by that is some of them are like, love those guys because they come in and really help me redesign. And some are like, oh my God, all those charts and all those forms and all those technologies or techniques kind of worry me. So they have this sort of like love-hate relationship to the question being asked, When do you redesign? I think that's when, if you're not expert in redesigning processes, getting some help from a green belt or a black belt or a yellow belt might be useful.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. Steve, if you wouldn't mind putting the very last slide up, we just wanted to let everybody know before they headed out that the topics that Steve covered and the books that Steve mentioned are further explored in our Manager Bootcamp program, which is now offered fully online. This interactive online program will give your frontline managers the skills to guide their teams through change, manage processes, improve productivity, and empower employee independence. The next session of Manager Bootcamp Online begins March 3rd, 2021. And lastly, our corporate learning team can help your organization integrate these topics into your existing performance management process. We will send out a recording of today's webinar in the next few days with a link to sign up for a complimentary discovery session with one of our team members. Thank you again for attending today's webinar. Thank you, Steve, and we hope you all stay well.